Look at his face. I mean,
Oh,
look at his face
mic
because he
drop.
knows he is
Mic
saying
drop.
it. It's
Yes, he
so
is.
funny because he knows he
He's
has been
using
saying
it
that
and
the
saying
whole
he's not.
time. That idea that these things are wrong or that there's a problem with these things just doesn't make any sense on atheism. And you just have to really say, okay, yeah, but why is that bad if no God exists? Who cares?
In less than 2 days, this video got more than 2 million views. I have no idea what it's going to be at when you guys are watching this, but it has exploded. And I was incredibly frustrated as somebody who traveled. I was out in Texas speaking on apologetics, and I watched this video and I thought, somebody's got to do something about this because the answers, I mean, am I allowed to give it away that they were so bad, or do you want to just see it, guys? It was the Christians need help. I'll reserve my thought here for just a second. Darwin, what did you think?
I completely agree. And this is unfortunately something that I see quite often when there are a bunch of Christians that go and debate an atheist that knows what they're talking about. It's very common where the Christian normies just get trounced. And I think that it's a really bad look and that these Christians just need to spend more time thinking about these things. And they're typically overconfident, I think. And that's pretty much what you see here in this video is overconfident Christians without good answers and essentially walking into a slaughter.
That is a great way to put it. I mean, well, you'll see as we watch this, and what we'd like to do is just kind of show you the video, add commentary along the way, so that you're understanding, because there's so many little nuances that if you haven't thought these arguments through or thought how to talk to an atheist about evil and suffering, there's so many little nuances that you need to understand before you engage in that conversation. And so this is actually going to be really good for you. I go to churches all the time, and I'm frustrated by how many Christians have what I call a very shallow faith. It's almost like, listen, I heard about this. I got the traditions, my mom and my dad, and I got it. And, I'm saved and I believe it and that's it. And I don't need any more. But honestly, you and I are called to give an answer to everyone that asks us a reason of the hope that's in us with meekness and fear. God commands this. And our answers need to be good. We're commanded to cast down arguments that exalt themselves against the knowledge of God. So our arguments need to be sound. Uh, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to change the skeptic's mind. Newsflash, if you didn't already know, Darwin was an atheist for a long time, weren't you?
Yeah, that's right. And what you're saying is absolutely correct. There's a lot of need for good apologetics in Christianity. I think it's one of the reasons why I became an atheist at such an early age because I was not getting good answers from my parents when I asked them questions about Christianity. They typically just said, well, you just need to have faith. And that's why I think that we really need to be talking to teenagers about apologetics and teaching them because they're at that age where they're about to go out into the world and they're just going to get blindsided by all of the sort of rhetoric that you're about to hear in this video. And they're going to be completely unprepared. And so many Christians are, frankly, just unprepared. And we need to be prepared and we need to have good answers. And there are good answers to these questions. We just need to study these things and be thoughtful about it. And hopefully, after watching this video, you guys will understand this topic in a more full light and be able to give a better answer in the future.
But when a child dies of leukemia,
could there be a purpose to it?
did God command the ethnic cleansing of the land of Israel?
Like, I'm not saying the scribe made something up. I'm saying the scribe has a command.
So where did they
that's
get that command from?
From God.
I had Jesus appear to me 3 years ago.
I don't know what's happening there. I have to suspect it's some kind of psychological phenomenon. Hi, my name's Alex O'Connor. I'm an atheist and host of the Within Reason podcast. And today I'm surrounded by 25 Christians who, God willing, might be able to change my mind.
What a setup, huh? I mean, definitely catchy, definitely clickbaity, definitely makes you go, okay, this is going to be good. One of these guys is going to be able to take Alex O'Connor down, is kind of the way the setup is.
So I think that this is just a bad look immediately for Christians because it makes it look like we need 25 Christians in order to even have a hope against one atheist. And I would just recommend that Christians not do this sort of thing because immediately we're in a no-win situation. Okay. Think about it. If we actually have a Christian that is in that panel who comes and wins an argument with Alex. Well, did he really win? No, not really. It reminds me of this guy that I was going to play tennis with. He said that he was really good and he was like 60 years old. And here I was about 27 at the time. And we had been talking back and forth about who was going to win. He eventually said to me, you know, when we play, I can't lose, right? And I said, yeah, you mean that you can't lose because you're older, you're so much older than me that if I win, then I just beat an old man. And if you win, then I just got beat by an old man. So either way, I lose. And that's the situation here, is that Alex really can't lose, because if he loses, he lost to one out of 25 guys, and it was unfair from the get-go. So did he really lose? No. And if he doesn't lose, it's even worse, because he just beat 25 Christians. And I told that old man, I said, I'm going to beat you because I'd rather beat an old man than get beat by an old man. And I think that if you do go into a situation like this, you should be looking to win, but it's still a no-win situation at the end of the day. And I think that Christians should have better discernment and try to avoid this sort of thing.
Yeah, I do find I like clickbait stuff. So I'm the guy that I saw this on the side panel as I was watching another video last night, and I immediately clicked it. I went, I want to watch that. So props to them for creating something that makes you want to watch it. And then it only took less than about 7 minutes for me to have to pause it to go, I'm incredibly frustrated. I'm incredibly frustrated.
Right.
I do wonder, where did they get these Christians? Like, it doesn't
Yeah.
ever say what are the credentials, because I'll grant it to you. I mean, Alex O'Connor is a top tier atheist. He's incredibly good. He was known as a cosmic skeptic for quite a while, and has had conversations with Christians for a long time. So he's honed his arguments really well, and he's very sharp. He's got a great wit. So he's definitely a top tier atheist.
I agree. I respect Alex O'Connor probably more than any other atheist that I can think of right now. I have a good deal of respect for him. I, of course, do think that he's wrong, and I think that he knows that God exists. But as far as his behavior goes, I think that he's about as well behaved as we could ask for from an atheist. And I wish that more atheists behaved as well as he does. So I want to give him props in that regard. I think that he is a very good spokesman and ambassador for atheism. And I also want to comment on the way that this is framed, where he says that I'm hoping that one of these Christians can change my mind, because I think that this is also really problematic when Christians buy into this frame. Because the problem isn't that Christians haven't made an argument that's good enough to change Alex O'Connor's mind. That's not the problem if you're a Christian. If you're a Christian, the problem is Alex O'Connor and that he wants to sin. It's his heart, not his head, that is the problem. So I see a lot of Christians buying into this atheist frame, like, oh, I just need evidence, or I just need a good argument. So then the Christian starts bending over backwards trying to provide this good argument or this good evidence to change the atheist mind. And that's not the problem. That's not actually the problem. The problem is that we are sinful and we want to live according to our values and not according to the will of God. That's always going to be the problem. And I'm not saying that Christians can't argue with atheists. I'm just saying that you shouldn't buy into this sort of frame that you're hearing right here. And you're always going to hear this from atheists, because they're never going to say, yeah, I know that God exists and I just want to sin. But just don't actually buy into that frame. You can say, I'm going to make the arguments, but I know that this isn't even going to change your mind. Like, we can run through it, but it's not the problem.
Darwin, there's going to be a lot of people that heard what you just said, and they're Christians, and that makes no sense to them whatsoever. What do you mean atheists aren't interested in the evidence? What do you mean they don't want to know? Now, I have had tens of thousands of conversations with atheists. I love having conversations with skeptics, and I know that to be true. Most Christians won't recognize that reality. They think, I just need a better argument. And we should have good arguments, but they think that. Can you, real quick, before we go to claim number one, which is suffering makes God's existence unlikely, can you expound, just give me a 60-second on, you were an atheist and you are saying from authority, and not just your authority, from the word of God, they are not interested in the truth. They don't want it. They are running. They're the thief. They're not looking for the cop. They're running from the cop.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's exactly the problem, is that they don't want there to be a God. They want to be their own gods. And a lot of atheists that are listening to this are going to be offended and think that I'm calling them liars. And in a way that they are lying, they're lying to themselves, most of them, because I think that a lot of them, on some level, genuinely believe that there's no God, but then on another level, they know. And no atheist truly lives as if God doesn't exist. Because if God really didn't exist, we shouldn't believe in things like our reasoning being sound, or the universe shouldn't be intelligible to us. We shouldn't be able to make sense of anything. If God didn't exist, there'd be no morality. Atheists do not live as if the universe is godless. They simply don't. I've never met one that did. I met some that came close, but at the end of the day, no one can live as if God does not exist.
It's almost like Paul got it right. I mean, he said the truths of God are manifest in them. God has shown it to them in Romans chapter 1. And when you look at their life, and you'll see this in Alex today. To me, Alex makes a great argument for God's existence, and he doesn't even realize it in this video that we're going to watch.
Yeah, I think that that's what we're going to show, is he's actually making an argument for the existence of a good God, and he's not making an argument against God. And yeah, let's hear what he has to say.
My first claim is that suffering makes God's existence unlikely.
Okay, I got to stop right there. Darwin, would you have raced to the chair? Just tell me honestly.
Absolutely not. I think that's a bad call. You don't want to go first. I mean, if you go first, everybody's going to see your face and everything because you're the first one that went. So anyone who watches this video is almost definitely going to see this guy. But I think that it's more strategic to listen to what Alex is going to say and to spend some time thinking about it before you go and sit down with them. It's always good to study your opponents and what they're saying for as long as you can before you respond to their argument. So I think that
now,
that's
granted, you only got 20 minutes.
Yeah, I would have waited.
On the screen, and I was debating. I was going, I think I would have waited, but at the same time, I think I would have wanted to bring a much more powerful argument that shuts that. Well, we're going to get into that shuts it down. And by the way, if you're one of the Christians that was on this, man, if we're dogging you too hard, forgive us. Darwin used to be an atheist and talks to atheists a lot, so just happens to understand a lot of the nuances. This is 25 years for me teaching apologetics, happen to know some of the nuances. So love you. Thank you for your willingness to even stand up, to even run to that chair and say, hey, I want to defend what I know to be true in God's word. Now, we're going to talk about how you did it, but I'm really proud of you for doing that. So any other thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's something to be said for that. I'm always thinking strategically because I'm a chess player. And I think that strategically, it's not the smartest move to make, but there is something to be said for the bravery part of it and for the eagerness, which I do appreciate. So kudos to him for that, at least.
When most Christians, less than 2% of Christians go share their faith, this is definitely good.
Good work.
Hey, Alex, how's it going?
How's it going? Nice to meet you.
Sage. Why don't you just begin? Why does suffering or evil make God's existence unlikely?
I think when confronted with two hypotheses, so atheism, naturalism, or theism, we should ask what we expect would occur under either hypothesis. And then we look at the world and we see what does actually occur. And what do we find? We find, I think most relevant here, a system of natural selection, the mechanism by which God apparently chose to bring animals and ultimately human beings into existence. A system which is defined by suffering. Survival of the fittest is the same thing as the death and suffering and destruction of the unfit. I'm told that the very mechanism that God chose to bring about the human species as the ultimate end of his creation was one that is imbued with suffering, such that 99.9% of all the species, let alone animals, that have ever existed on planet Earth have been brutally wiped from existence into extinction. And I think that that's less likely on theism. If you assume atheism or materialism, not only do you explain this, you also come to expect it.
Pause right there. Any thoughts, or you want me to go?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts actually about this. So the first thing here is I want everyone to notice that he said there are two hypotheses where you've got God existing or God not existing, and you're placed in a world with suffering. And in that world, should we expect that God exists or that God doesn't exist in that world? And I want to point that out because later on in the video, and we're going to get there, but he then claims that he's doing an internal critique. And an internal critique is completely different informed than what he's saying right now. And I just want to point it out because right now he's making a probabilistic argument, whereas an internal critique is, let me step all the way into your worldview and I'm going to check all of the beliefs and look for inconsistencies or incongruity or contradictions, these sorts of things. That's not what he's doing right now. Right now, he's making an argument saying, you place me in a world, I see suffering, and that means that God is less likely to exist probabilistically. He's not saying that God can't exist as suffering exists. He's just saying it's less likely. And what I really want to say to this argument is that why is suffering bad? Okay, because the problem here is that he's tapping into something that we all kind of agree on, that suffering is bad. But let's look at what he's really doing. Imagine if he had said that we fall into a world, or we find ourselves in a world where everyone is happy and there's just perfect bliss. And if we find ourselves in this world where everyone is happy and there's no unhappiness at all, everyone is happy. If we find ourselves in this world, then that means that it's unlikely that God, who is good, would exist. Now, of course, if you heard him say this, you would say to yourself, wait, why would unhappiness mean that a good God wouldn't exist? And he would have to say that there was something intrinsically wrong with happiness in order to make the case that a good God wouldn't allow happiness. But what this means is that happiness would have to be bad for his argument to work. It would have to be actually bad, because there's two things that you could ask him here. You could say, well, Alex, is happiness like actually bad, or is it just something that you happen to not like? And he can't say that it's just something that he happens to not like, because then that completely devalues his argument, because it doesn't make sense that just because I happen to not like something, that God is less likely to exist, right? I mean, just like it doesn't make sense that your parents don't love you if you happen to not like broccoli and they make you eat broccoli. That doesn't follow that your parents don't love you or something like that, or that you have bad parents just because you happen to not like something that they do or whatever. So he's going to have to say that there's something actually bad about happiness in order for his argument to make sense, because God, who's good, would stop the bad thing. But here's the problem, is that he can't explain on his own worldview why why suffering or happiness is bad. Okay, because you would have to say that suffering is actually bad, or that happiness is actually bad, whichever one you want to say, he has to explain why that thing is actually bad. So what I'm trying to get at here is Alex isn't actually saying you're placed in a world and you find suffering, because that's arbitrary, right? Imagine he said you're placed in a world and you find grass, and that means that God is less likely, or you're placed in a world and you find rocks, and that makes God less likely. No, what he's really saying is you're placed in a world and you find objective badness or objective wrongness. That's what he's actually saying. Because if that's not what he's saying, then whatever suffering is no more relevant than grass or rocks or anything else. So now when you distill his argument down to what he's really saying, what he's really getting at, he's saying you're placed in a world and you find objective badness. And now the question is, which worldview makes sense on when you're dealing with objective bad things, right? Objectively bad things. And the only worldview that could make sense of that sort of thing, of an objective value, is theism. Because in theism, we can make sense of that because God has a mind and God has a plan. He's got a plan for creation. And so within that plan, God values certain things according to his plan. So there are objective values within that sort of framework. And that's the only way you're going to get an objective value, because if it's not a value coming from God, if it's not God saying this is good and this is bad, then it's just Alex telling us he doesn't like broccoli, or he doesn't like grass, or he doesn't like rocks, which doesn't matter, So it's got to be an objective value, and objective values can only exist in a theistic system. They can't exist in an atheistic system. And you'll actually hear Alex admitting this later on when he gets pressed slightly on this, that he doesn't believe in objective values. And he doesn't believe in objective values because he knows that those don't make sense in his worldview. So what I'm trying to point out from the get-go here is that Alex is actually making an argument for theism, not against it, because there can't be anything objectively bad if atheism is true. And yet Alex's whole argument is literally built on the idea or the premise that we have something in our world that's objectively bad. So really, the problem of suffering is an argument for God, not against God.
So I see the same. I say one more thing, but inside that he said suffering or evil make God's existence unlikely. I think we're confronted with two hypotheses: atheism, naturalism, or theism. And so he's trying to say, hey, there's two ideas. And what often happens in these conversations is, well, which worldview are you talking about? Because like you're saying, Darwin, inside of atheism, suffering is fine because it's not objectively bad. Who cares? You may not like it, but that's just your opinion. And opinions are like armpits. Everybody's got them. Most of them stink. So why is your opinion more important than anybody else's opinion? So, and they would argue, I grant it, they would argue, well, no, probably nobody likes suffering. Okay. But besides that, you're not doing objective morals on atheism. Then you'll see him switch over to theism and act like he's doing his internal critique. And so you'll see this switching happening, and he goes back and forth between, well, hang on, which worldview are you in right now? And you'll see it switch back and forth. My bigger picture is the setup right now. What he just set up is certainly not the God of the Bible. And that's the very first thing from an argumentative, actually, second thing, Darwin's first. Look, you can't account for it. Second thing, though, would be, hey, you just said.
And what do we find? We find, I think most relevant here, a system of natural selection, the mechanism by which God apparently chose to bring animals and ultimately human beings into existence. A system which is defined by suffering. Survival of the fittest is the same thing as the death and suffering and destruction of the unfit. I'm told that the very mechanism that God chose to bring about the human species as the ultimate end of his creation was one that is imbued with suffering, such that 99.9% of all the species, let alone animals, that have ever existed on planet Earth have been brutally wiped from existence into extinction.
That is not the God of the Bible. What he did, and this is important at the very get-go, because you'll see this over and over as Christians come and try to have a conversation with him. He set up a theistic evolution God, not the God of the Bible. He set up a God that used evolution. Evolution is absolutely true in his mind. There's no questioning that. So if that's absolutely true, he's putting that on top of Scripture and saying God used evolution, and a God that used evolution would be a bad God because there's lots of death and suffering, and it doesn't make sense if he's a loving God. And I would argue he's exactly right. He's dead on. If you believe in the God of evolution, this doesn't make sense. That is an evil God. If you have a God that says he's moral and can account for morality, and that God used billions of years of death and suffering to get mankind, that, like, who wants to worship that God? That's not the loving God. But when we read Scripture, what do we find? We find a God who created it perfect to begin with and made man and said, I'm going to let you choose. And man chose to sin and disobey God, and sin brought about death. The reason we have death, and you'll hear a lot about the death and suffering and stuff like that, the reason that's here is because of the fall of man. At least the biblical view of Christianity has an answer for that. The evolutionary theistic evolution view does not. Even the old earth creation worldview does not. So 3 categories, just so you understand it, because I'll probably mention it again. You got theistic evolution, God used evolution. That's what he just presented in his opening statement. You got old earth creation. Well, there was still billions of years, and God created over time somehow, a couple different methods of how they think God did that. Old earth creation would say God still created over billions of years. You still got the death and suffering of the animals problem. And then you got biblical creation, which says God made it perfect to begin with. Man sinned and brought death into God's perfect creation. And that's why they're suffering. So I know it's a lot to try to keep in mind, but 2 arguments. What Darwin just said, the atheists can't account for it. And then he just set up a straw man to true biblical Christianity. That to me is going to be my big deal. And I think you'll hear him argue for true biblical Christianity here in just a minute.
What is your, I guess, epistemology? How do you know that this is the case, that it's less likely, and that, an atheist worldview, a naturalistic worldview would look like the way it is today?
Of course, we don't know, but that's why I use the phraseology of unlikely.
So I want to point out here that the Christian is asking him, what is your epistemology? And he doesn't actually answer the question. I mean, he starts with saying, if you're placed in the world, and he's basically going back over his argument. But when you ask him on a question, you need to pay attention to whether or not they answer that question. And he didn't actually give his epistemology when he was asked for it. And that's very relevant because most atheists, well, actually, I would argue all atheists don't have an epistemology that can account for knowledge. I think atheists should essentially be solipsists. And I know some atheists that actually are, but he completely sidestepped that question. And when you're talking to atheists, you need to be very aware of when you ask a question and you don't get an answer to that question. So I just want to point that out.
No, that's powerful. And you'll hear him do that a couple of different times here. And I can't help but think he knows where the epistemological argument goes. He knows that atheism cannot ground truth. He knows that just like who was it? What's the other guy that basically said, I'm a solipsist, big atheist guy on the Atheist channel out of Texas.
Talking about Matt Dillahunty?
Matt Dillahunty. Yeah. Matt Dillahunty. Sorry, Matt. I didn't mean that as, I just meant I'm taller than you. That's all. Matt Dillahunty. he admitted, he's admitted before, I guess I am, he makes fun of solipsism, hangs up on the people. And then he admits, I kind of have to be a solipsist. And a solipsist says, I can't know anything at all, except that I don't know anything. And it's an internally inconsistent worldview. It's an impossible worldview to hold. So this happened. I can't help but think Alex knows this and has to avoid it. And this is what you'll see all the time. And you got to learn how to hold their feet to the fire. They will squirm. You're going to have to do it in love, but you got to hold their feet to the fire. You didn't answer my question. How do you know anything to be true?
Right.
And you could follow that up. Here's what I do. I follow it up with this question. Well, is it possible that you could be wrong about everything you think you know? And a true skeptic like him would have to say, I don't believe I am, but yes, it is possible. And at that point, they've given up knowledge. And that's a very different tactic to take the debate that direction and go, whoa. You can't even account for knowledge. And you're saying God, you don't believe God exists? So anyway, different approach, but agreed.
I don't think that the avenue that he's going down is terrible, but I do want to just point out the correct question in my view is, why is suffering bad? Or why does suffering mean that God is less likely? Because that premise really isn't being challenged. I don't think it's really challenged at all. I think all of the Christians, for the most part, pretty much just grant it. And that's the problem with the entire argument, is that this idea that suffering is just bad and therefore God is less likely is not sound. It's not a sound premise. So you have to ask, what does he mean by suffering? Is suffering just something that we find arbitrarily and there's no reason why that would make God less likely? Or is it that suffering is somehow intrinsically bad and that there are these objective values of goodness and badness, and suffering falls into the category of being objectively bad, and yet that's somehow an argument for atheism? Are you sure about that? That's exactly where you need to go with this sort of argument.
I think that if you were to tell somebody who was sort of in some Rawlsian state of nature, hadn't seen the world, and you said that the world has been created by an omnibenevolent, all-powerful God, what kind of world would that person be imagining? And if you dropped them into the world, if you were given the opportunity to become a wild animal, like in 2 seconds, I was just going to turn you into a random wild animal somewhere on planet Earth. I
like being a guy.
I think you'd probably kill yourself before I had the opportunity, because you know that the life of these animals is almost defined in terms of their suffering.
I guess I just don't really see how you can justify that claim per se. What I would say is that if we actually take into account the holistic view of the scriptures, which I do think that you have to do, we see that it's actually much more coherent once you acknowledge that evil itself doesn't have ontology. Evil's not a thing. You don't look under a rock and say, there's the evil, right?
Fine by
and
me.
So I just want to say right here that the Christian is making a mistake by conflating evil with suffering. And a lot of Christians and atheists do this, where they talk about the problem of evil and they throw in suffering, and it's just not the same problem. I mean, think about what suffering actually is, okay? Let's talk about suffering for a minute. Suffering is when something happens that we don't like. Okay, so imagine you've got a coworker and he comes into the office and you say, "Hey, how you doing?" And he says, "I just got divorced." And your immediate reaction is, "Oh, I'm so sorry," right? And you start trying to console him. And then he says, "What do you mean? That marriage was terrible. This is the best day of my life." Okay, so why is he not suffering? Why did you expect him to be suffering? You expected him to be suffering because most people would be wanting their marriage to thrive and to survive and to not end in divorce. But notice the key word here is want. You would expect them to want to be in a healthy marriage. But the reason why this particular man would not be suffering is because he wanted the divorce. So all suffering is basically predicated on what we want or what we do not want. Okay, so if you want something and you don't get what you want, then that ultimately is suffering. And that's really all it is. It's just, I want this thing and I don't get it. So I'm suffering right now. I mean, if we could enjoy pain, if you could create a person that enjoyed pain, then they wouldn't be suffering when they were in pain as long as they were enjoying it. It really is that simple. So all of suffering, in my view, is tied to just not getting your personal desires. And I really don't understand why we would expect to be in a world where all of our desires are met all the time by God, especially when you've got different people, different subjects who have different conflicting desires. And we literally cannot be God because only God can be God. So there's one thing that we could all desire that could never be. So in that sense, you would almost necessarily have suffering. But why would we think that God would just be granting all of our desires all the time, even though there are desires he literally couldn't grant, like turning us into God himself? But I just don't understand really this argument of suffering, because when you really distill what suffering is, it's just people or subjects not getting what they want. That doesn't mean that it's bad, though. How many parents here don't give their children what their children want, and yet we know that it's for their good? My daughter wanted to eat marshmallows for breakfast. I didn't give her what she wanted. She cried. She was suffering in her mind. But did I do the wrong thing? No, I did not. So I think that we really need to sit down as Christians and atheists and talk about what suffering really is and why it's actually a big deal. Because I don't think that it is at the end of the day. I understand that we have loved ones and our loved ones die and we can be in extreme pain. But ultimately, all suffering is just us not getting what we want. That's it. That's all it is.
Now, okay. So Alex at the very beginning, or the intro to the show, kind of revealed that he's going to talk about a child that has leukemia and dies at a very young age. And why is that suffering? And tell me what you think about this, Darwin, because I see all the time atheists switch out logic for emotion and then pretend that it was logical. They're like, oh, but wait, and then they get somebody on a, well, yeah, I wouldn't want my daughter to die of leukemia. I wouldn't want my daughter to get run over by a car. I wouldn't want my son to get killed in a motorcycle accident. I wouldn't want that suffering. That's suffering. Why would God allow that? If God's all loving or all powerful, why would God allow that? So they take an emotion and try to use it as logic, and they're actually doing a bait and switch when they do that.
Yeah, they are. And they're not being honest about what their atheism entails. Alex is a little bit more honest in this video because he's going to say that he doesn't believe in objective values. But which is more absurd, to think that there's a good God that allows suffering, that allows children to suffer, or to think that there's nothing wrong with children suffering in the first place, that when a child gets leukemia and dies, and has all this pain, that there's nothing wrong with that at all, that's just something that happened and it's no different than a rock rolling down a river or stream or something like that, and that there's no point to any of this. Which of those two things or ideas is more absurd? And I'm going to tell you which one is more absurd. It's the second one. that there's nothing wrong
Yeah.
with the world, that evil doesn't exist, that we're all just supposed to be living this way, or actually that there's no way that things are supposed to be at all, and we're just drifting through space. And that's what atheism entails.
And that's why you're going to see Alex argue for the truth of the God of the Bible in this clip. You're going to love this.
So I'm not really talking about evil here, because that's, of course, a moral term. I'm talking about suffering.
Can you distinctualize suffering and evil?
So evil is a moral term. Evil means that something is bad, it's immoral. You need to have a moral ontology for that. Suffering is just any experience that's not wanted when experienced.
He literally agreed with me right there, where he said it's just any experience that we don't want. He and I are agreed on that. So what he's not agreeing with me on, but what he's obviously wrong about, is that his argument requires a moral ontology still, because you still need objective badness for his argument to make sense. Because if there is no objective badness, then the suffering is no different than
Just-
paint on a wall or anything. So if there's no objective badness,
in philosophy, in philosophy, you've heard of this. It's called the is-ought fallacy. What Alex is describing is what is the case. It is the case that children will get leukemia. It is the case that the rock rolled down the hill. What a great analogy.
right?
Now, why ought that be different on atheism? And this is again where you're going to see, well, hang on, are you arguing in the atheist universe, or are you arguing in the Christian universe? And you're going to see this flip flop back and forth. In the atheist universe, in the atheist worldview, in Alex's worldview, who cares? It just is. Only in a
Right.
Christian worldview can you say this is what ought to happen. That child ought not have died from leukemia. That deer ought not have gotten, eaten by the lion or whatever. So
Right.
only in Christianity you have these oughts. In atheism, you just have what is. So you got to watch which way he's going there.
Yeah, can I elaborate on that just briefly? Well, hopefully it's brief, but imagine two video games, okay? Imagine a video game that somehow comes about through a random process, like a cat was just stepping on a keyboard and somehow randomly created a video game. All right. Now imagine a video game that is created by a mind with intention, with goals and purposes. There's actually something that you're supposed to be doing and achieving within this game. Okay. Now, on which of those two video games would you expect for there to be something wrong or bad, right? The first game, right, where it just comes about through no intention, you couldn't actually point to anything and say, this is bad or this is wrong or something like that, because there's no point to the game. The game isn't even meant to exist, right? It just happens to exist through a random process. Whereas in the second example, where a game comes about through the intention of a mind, then it does make sense to talk in reference of a goal, and this thing is bad and this thing is good. This sword is bad because it's not going to help you achieve the goal of the game. Well, in atheism, it's very much like that first game, where we're all just here as a result of some mindless natural process, and there's no point to any of this. We shouldn't even be here. We're just an accident. So there's no good, there's no bad. You cannot get what you were talking about, Eric. You cannot get prescriptions. You've only got descriptions. So you have a descriptive universe, just like in that game with the cat that the cat creates. You have a game and you can describe certain things within the game, but there's no way that the game ought to be. Okay. There's no prescriptiveness, I guess you could say, in that game. But in the second game, you could say that there are things that you ought to be doing based on the goals of the game. So if you think about a game like maybe Skyrim, you're supposed to go and kill the dragon at the end or whatever. So you actually have like kind of obligations within the game to build up your armor and to get stronger and to learn how to do this and to meet this person. It's all towards the end goal of the game, which can only come from a mind. There's nothing like that in atheism. There is no mind that's responsible for our reality. So you can only have descriptions in atheism. You can never get prescriptions.
Right, and so even if you don't have a moral objectivism, you can still say that suffering exists. So here's a question. A deer gets its leg caught under the branch of a tree that's fallen over in the wild, and it starves to death in confused agony. Why does God oversee this? And why does God set the natural world up such that events like this occur?
Well, because the ultimate view here is that
Okay, pause.
Nice to meet you. Good work.
Alex, my man. Good to
How's it
meet you.
going?
My
Nice to
name's
meet you
Tim.
too.
Okay, so my first question to start out with is what exactly about suffering makes this unlikely on the condition that God exists?
Okay, what do you think about that question right there? Tim, new guy up. It was Sage before, right? So Sage ran out of time, and it is hard when they definitely create an environment here where it's like, oh man, if I don't say the right thing, they're going to vote me out. And I'm trying to go down a path, and all of a sudden the path is stopped.
You said, what about suffering makes it unlikely that if it exists, that God is unlikely to exist? And I think that it's the right question. I think that it could be said in a more narrow and focused way. And I don't think that Alex is really going to answer the question, if I remember correctly, but he's
Right.
on the right track. And it's the sort of question that should be being asked because he's challenging the premise that is really the linchpin of Alex's argument.
I think that if God is all loving, then he probably wouldn't want his creatures to suffer. And so I think that the fact that they do suffer makes his existence less likely.
So right there, he gives this answer like God wouldn't want his creatures to suffer. And you should ask, though, like imagine that Alex O'Connor had said that if we find ourselves in a world with grass, that God is less likely. And you say, okay, but why? And he says, because God wouldn't want grass in a world. See, he's not really answering the question, though. You need to say,
Oh, that's good.
yeah, you need to actually explain or get him to say, because grass is bad. That's what you need to get him to say, because really he's making an argument that we find ourselves in a world where there is an objectively bad thing, not just a thing I don't like, but an objectively bad thing. And so Alex kind of just basically restated what he had initially said, but he didn't actually say what it is about suffering that makes it such that it would make God less likely or probable. Because if he does say that, he's going to have to account for how this objectively bad thing exists on atheism. And actually, it's an argument for theism now.
Okay, perfect. And is there some specific aspect of suffering that you're particularly honing in on, horrendous or whatever
In
that is?
particular, non-human animal suffering. Because I think that the Christianity has a celebrated tradition of theodicies trying to explain why suffering exists.
Yeah.
Human free will, the development of the soul, higher order goods, all of this kind of stuff, none of which apply to the suffering of non-human animals.
So
I do
right
feel
now,
like he had him on something, and he should have stuck with it.
yeah.
He has this idea that he's heard from somebody that he wants to spit out, and so he's excited about his idea. But he had him on something, and you watched Alex go to specifically animal suffering, specifically why we got to allow animal suffering for millions of years. And for me, I again go, hold it. Do you think that God created this world to be like this? Or did God create the world to be perfect and we messed it up? If I was arguing, I'd say, oh, okay, even animal suffering, stop. We're still on the wrong path here. You have a misunderstanding of how it all got started.
Yeah, and also I want to point out that Alex kind of switched over to talking about Christianity. And in my view, no one should really be talking about Christianity because it's too narrow, it's too focused for this argument. This argument is not about Christianity. This argument is about, is atheism true or is theism true? And Christianity is a subset of theism. So in my mind, we really shouldn't be talking about Christianity in this debate. We should be talking about just, is there a creator or is there not a creator? And that's pretty much it. Now, I'm not saying that Christians don't have a good answer for suffering. I'm just saying when it's juxtaposed this way that Alex did in his argument, Christianity is really, I would say, not relevant because he's just saying, hey, we find ourselves in a world. Is there a God or isn't there a God? And a lot of the Christians, if I remember correctly, they try to bring Christianity into it as if it's the answer. But that's kind of asking or bringing in an answer that is after we would establish that God exists in the first place, that Christianity would be true. So I think that it's a little bit not relevant.
That's interesting because I think I would almost differ with you on that from the perspective of I want to argue what we believe, what I believe is true. And
Yeah.
Alex, I want you to argue what you believe is true. Because otherwise what we end up doing is, and I get it from a logical perspective. Okay, let's first prove God, then let's prove which God, because there's a whole lot of different gods. Then
Yeah.
let's find out, okay, so there's this logical path that we try to think through and go down. But since I've done it, because I've watched William Lane Craig do this, and William Lane Craig will say, hey, the argument I'm giving is not for Christianity. You should be happy. I'm only arguing for theism. And I go, okay, I get that, and maybe you're right. Maybe that has its place here. But I find myself going, I'd rather say, let's not argue what we don't believe. Let's argue what we do believe. And I don't believe in general theism. I believe in Christianity. I believe in the God revealed in Scripture. So
Yeah.
I'm starting there. Where are you starting? Okay. Do you want to start on my foundation? Because if you're going to start on my foundation, we can go through these things and we can actually understand it internally, it makes sense. And if we start on your foundation, it internally doesn't make sense. Now we're doing true internal critiques. But I guess that's how I think about it.
Yeah, I totally understand that. What I'm trying to point out is that Alex is just framing this as a simple argument between atheism and theism. And so, based on Alex's argument, he gets to kind of make the argument. So, in response to that, what I'm saying is, but if Alex had said, can your worldview better account for suffering than my worldview? Now, in my view, Christianity should absolutely be in that discussion, and we should be using Bible verses and all kinds of things like that. But because Alex is framing his argument in the way that he is, I think that it's a little bit of a red herring to even bring up Christianity by either of them.
Have you heard of the axiological expectation mismatch problem?
I have not.
Okay, so philosophers of religion have started to understand that the thing that actually generates a problem between God and suffering is actually the value system you attach to the very attribute of perfect lovingness. Because the problem of evil is an internal critique, you have to look at a very specific version of theism and how it defines perfect lovingness. I want to present to you a version where my version of perfect lovingness does not actually constitute a problem and a misalignment, that mismatch between the suffering of animals, let's just say the profusion of suffering of animals, and the existence of God.
So let's hear it. What kind of God are we imagining that would allow and oversee and do nothing to prevent billions of years of untold animal suffering?
So he basically did what you just said, right? He basically said, hey, let me come to this very specific point let me argue from my point.
Right. Yeah, and the Christian, I think, made the mistake of saying that the problem of evil is an internal critique. It certainly can be an internal critique. It depends on the way that it's given. But the way that Alex started with his argument and the way that he framed it, it was as a probabilistic argument, it was not an internal critique. He did not say that if theism is true, then evil would not exist, or anything like that, or that suffering would not exist, and that the concept of suffering and the concept of God are, incoherent or something like that. He didn't say that. He said we find ourselves in a world, and in that world there's suffering, and we would think that God would be less likely if we find suffering. So therefore, we should think that atheism is true. That was how he started. That's not an internal critique, and to reframe it as an internal critique is a huge mistake, I think, because it allows Alex to switch back and forth where he can step outside of Christianity or outside of theism and say, well, this is bad. And then, or that God wouldn't allow this or something like that.
Yeah,
inside. And then he can step outside of it as an atheist and basically critique God and kind of do what he's doing. He's kind of, it allows him to jump in and out of the worldview at will, essentially, which is really cheating in this sort of conversation. But it's very common for atheists to do this, where they do the hokey pokey. They put their foot in to the worldview and then they take it out, and then they put their foot in and then they take it out. And that's very common.
And it frustrates Christians because you're like, I got them tied down, and then they jump out, and you're like, okay, now I'm over here. And then they jump back in. And you're like, okay, now. And if you don't recognize what's going on, it's incredibly frustrating to watch them do this.
Yeah, you really have to know when someone is doing an internal critique and when they're not.
Right. So you're talking about non-prevention.
Or setting up the system that is natural selection, such that it relies upon things like predation and disease.
Well, the first part is I don't agree with the whole setting up the system part. So I'm not one of those theists that believes that God does this select and pick idea of creating worlds. I don't think that God actually creates worlds. I think that God lets worlds develop according in a certain way, but because God can oversee an overarching narrative, he knows exactly how he can redeem anything that goes. So the first time, sorry, go ahead.
Could God have made it such that animals were all herbivores instead of carnivores and omnivores?
Yes, he could totally do that.
Okay, so had he done that, here's an instant way to reduce by orders of magnitude the amount of suffering that exists.
I have to pause there, Darwin, because I'm like, guys, did you hear that? And I go, have you I feel like I want to just pull a line out of Jesus. Have you not read? Don't you know? That's exactly the world that God made. God said, for all the animals, I have made every green herb for meat. Originally, everything was herbivore. So again, you find Alex going, if biblical Christianity were true, that would make a lot more sense. If young earth, literal Genesis, biblical Christianity were true, that would make a whole lot more sense. And that's exactly what we see here. I'm going, great point, Alex. And that now I think his name is Tim. I don't believe Tim would fall into that category. And it's sad because biblical creation has got such a bad rap. Oh, who would believe that? All science today proves that it's millions of years old or that evolution happened. And I'm like, no, it hasn't. Science has not proven this. So science doesn't say anything. Scientists do. We look at the same data and we can easily see how it conforms or what's the other C word? It confirms, there it is, confirms what the Bible says. So you're right. We see evil and suffering, animals eating other animals. If they had all been herbivore, that would make a whole lot more sense. And that's exactly what the Bible says he did. And this is where I found myself just pulling my hair out last night going, but that's what God did, guys. That's exactly what God did.
Well, it's a great Christian answer, and I totally agree with you, of course. What I want to show here, though, is that the problem that is occurring is that this guy who started off with a good question but didn't actually get the answer that he should have gotten, he has now bought into Alex's frame, which is that suffering is intrinsically bad, both on atheism and on theism, and that we find this intrinsically bad thing. And so now the theist has to account for it. And as soon as you buy into that frame, now you have to start coming up with theodicies and all these explanations for why children are getting cancer and these sorts of things. And the atheist really can just sit back and watch you squirm and start, they can just bring up all these horrible atrocities, which is what Alex is pretty much doing. And it's a huge mistake to just buy into this frame and just give the atheist that objective values exist, which is what has happened here. And that's why this guy is about to get demolished. You have to question their presuppositions. He's presupposing that there is something objectively wrong with suffering.
But hold on, that's particularly assuming a value theory already that I haven't told you I'm adopting that has a problem with the evil. So I have to give you my value theory first for you to show that misalignment.
Okay, let's hear it.
Perfect. Okay, so my value theory says that it's not the most important thing about a sentient creature is not what merely happens to them. It's about the total timeline of their life and where their life permanently ends. Meaning, if you were to judge an author of a narrative and the first few chapters, let's say, there's a lot of bad things happening, but the end ends with this crescendo where there's victoriousness, there's redemption, there's beauty, and everyone in the story actually endorses their entire existence that they lived. They can look at their they can look at their total timeline, and they actually each subjectively come to the conclusion, I'm glad I was made, and I totally see what my suffering was for. That's the particular I'm using with. So we have to judge, like John Hicks says, we have to judge the very nature of God's lovingness by what he does in the end, not these few time slices that we observe right now. For you to show that there's a problem, you have to show to me that the suffering of animals cannot be transformed, are intrinsically cut off from being transformed into a life that they will endorse.
Pause. You got a thought on that? I got a thought on that.
Yeah, I didn't like what he said at the end, that you have to show to me that, basically animals can not essentially reflect back on their lives, because really it doesn't matter if Alex shows to him that there's this truth that it can't be true that animals reflect back. It's really not relevant to Alex's argument, frankly, because Alex is just saying if we find ourselves in a world and there's suffering, it seems like that would be less likely if theism was true. So this whole idea that like we can animals may be able to reflect back on their lives and be like, oh, actually the suffering was worth it, is totally irrelevant because it's ad hoc reasoning. You're kind of reasoning after the case in order to kind of come up with an explanation for the suffering and for why it's actually a good thing. But it doesn't matter because Alex is just saying, here's the suffering and it seems like it's bad and God wouldn't allow it. That's all Alex is saying. So ad hoc reasoning really isn't relevant to the argument that Alex is making, frankly.
I feel like I've heard this kind of conversation from pastors. And okay, tell me what I don't know how to think through this yet. So walk me through this, because there is a point at which, hey, you know what? God is going to work all things together. Everybody say it with me, for good. God is going to bring everything together for good. And the Bible passages about that. So when I've heard this talked and when I've heard this, preached or argued, it's like, hey, somehow God is going to use the suffering of your little boy or your little girl, or take the animals outside, my dog getting run over by a car. Somehow that suffering is going to end up being used for God's good, even if I don't understand it. Mm-hmm. Is that a valid argument? Is that a good argument?
It's not a good argument for what Alex is saying. I think that it's possible, but I don't think it's relevant to Alex's argument at all because, like I said, he's just noticing that there's suffering. So how we make sense of the suffering after the fact really doesn't matter to the point of the argument, which is just that we see suffering.
Yeah, it's good to keep your eye on that prize, because I understand where he's going. And in the Christian worldview, I would say, look what God has done. He took the worst thing that could ever happen in all of human history, his perfect son, and his death on the cross, unbelievable suffering. And he used that for his good. So
yeah,
from a theological perspective, I agree. But you're right. It's a good way to keep your eye on the prize, on the target, and say, hang on. We're not even there yet.
Yeah, exactly. I think that it's good to just try and focus on the actual argument that's being made and not start talking about how it makes sense or how it could make sense. It's really secondary and kind of another bit of a red herring, I think, to be doing that. What should be happening is the Christians should be putting Alex on the back foot and forcing him to justify his premise, which is that there's a problem with suffering. That's where that's what's being missed right now, and the Christian is the one that's trying to come up with reasons and justifications because he's just granted the most important premise of Alex's argument, which he should have never done.
So this is offense versus defense, if you think of it like that. Right now he's playing defense. Okay, yeah. Well, let me defend why God should allow suffering rather than offense. What's wrong? Who cares?
That's what Christians tend to do, is they tend to play defense. They don't tend to play offense. They tend to just grant the atheist their Christian presuppositions. And you should never do that. You should never just grant the atheist our Christian presuppositions, because as soon as you do that, then they're going to be doing the hokey pokey where they put their foot in and they take their foot out. They're looking at it from the atheist worldview when it's convenient, and then they step in and do a quick, quote unquote, internal critique, which never really is an internal critique. So you should always know which presuppositions are being used by the atheist and stop them when they use those presuppositions and challenge them on that, because they're going to be right in the middle of every argument that an atheist makes. And those presuppositions are frankly undone by atheism itself.
There's a couple of theses on the table.
Okay.
But sure, go ahead.
Okay. So are you talking about the end of their life is in their end of life on earth, or are you talking about the afterlife?
I'm antemortem, postmortem.
Because if you're just talking about life on earth, then I would say that if you had an author writing a book and a character, if we were trying to figure out the relationship between that author and the person in the book, and that person in the book shows up for 5 seconds in the first chapter and is a child who almost immediately dies of cancer in an incredibly painful way. And there's no development, there's no sort of bringing back to life and suddenly everyone's grateful for it. It is just this miserable, tragic experience. And I asked, well, what did the author not want to do for the story of the book, but want to do for that character?
Yes.
I think it would be pretty damning. And also, when it comes to animals,
Yeah.
we're talking about animals who are predated on from the moment that they begin existence.
Absolutely.
They sort of have disease. Zebras, when they're killed by lions, are often too big to be killed instantly,
Right.
so they die over minutes with their windpipes caught in the jaws of a lion. How can this be developing a zebra, which, by the way, probably doesn't even have the same kind of first-person conscious experience that humans do in order to sort of rationalize and abstract and learn from their sort of past and morally develop in that way? They just suffer. And what kind of God could oversee this?
So I just want to point out here, he's talking about something that is very intuitive to us once again. But imagine if we change what he's saying and he was just simply, once again, talking about grass, and he's describing how, imagine we find grass and sometimes the grass, gets mowed, right? Like it's short. And then other times it's longer, and he's just like describing how grass does certain things and it grows. And then there's weeds sometimes, and then there's not weeds other times. Would any of that be compelling at all? It wouldn't. He's really just tapping into something that's super intuitive for human beings. But if atheism is true, then there's really no difference between describing the life cycle of grass and describing the suffering and pain of living creatures. It's all totally relative and doesn't mean anything. And there's no point to any of it. So he's basically really honing in and tapping in on something that we just know and don't want to argue against. But if you just change the language, you can see how much he's actually assuming. Because if he were to be talking about grass right now, you'd say, wait. Why does any of that disprove God? Just like, who cares if grass only lives a day and then dies sometimes because it's cold out? That wouldn't disprove that God exists. Is there like some kind of value to grass? Hello. And that's what you have to do. You have to just change the language and insert different words and then see what is really happening underneath the surface. And what's happening underneath the surface, once again, is that he's assuming objective moral values exist, and he's not being honest about that.
Yeah, to me, it's just like you said at the beginning. He's taking something emotional that tugs on our heartstrings and swapping it for something logical. And he just did the bait and switch right there. He just did the emotions and then assumed that was bad, and he's not going to be called on it.
Right. Yeah, and it's difficult. It literally causes humans, I think, pain in a way, like mental pain, to push back on these sorts of things that are just so intuitively true to us.
Yes.
But we have to remember that it's intuitively true to us because God exists. That's why these things are so intuitively true to us. But that idea that these things are wrong or that there's a problem with these things just doesn't make any sense on atheism. And you just have to really say, okay, yeah, but why is that bad if no God exists? Who cares?
Yeah. I've even gone this far when I'm having these conversations. I go, wow, you are arguing just like a theist. Like you are making some great arguments for theism, and go ahead and point out, you're not arguing what you think you're arguing. You're actually arguing theism here. You're not arguing atheism. You're being a very good theist. That would be a problem. Yeah, you're right. There's a problem in the world, and you can't account for that without theism. You're arguing like a great Christian right now.
It's true. Every time I think about evil or suffering or any of these things, I'm always like, oh, well, God's got to exist because there's a problem here. And in order for there to be an actual problem in the world, a way that the world should be but isn't, that requires theism to be true. It can't make sense on atheism.
Okay, so there's a lot of assumptions on the table again. Again, you're assuming a particular value system that I'm not laying
I'll tell you what
out.
I'm assuming here. What I'm assuming here is that a good God would not allow unnecessary suffering to obtain.
Okay, gotcha. So we can
Do you agree with that?
We can talk about unnecessary suffering.
You should have said why. Why?
Okay. Yeah, great question. A good God would not allow. Okay. So now he's jumped back into theism.
Yeah.
And he's arguing from a theistic worldview. And he's in there saying a good God would not allow. Did he say would not allow?
Yeah, he said a good God would not allow theism would not allow suffering.
We're talking about the justifying norms for suffering. You're saying it has to be in terms of necessity, which is an evil is only authorizable by God if it's in connection to a greater good or prevention of a greater evil, correct?
If there's some kind of justification for allowing that
Yeah,
suffering.
but you're saying it's a necessary connection. What's the term of necessity?
So perhaps I should say unjustified instead of unnecessary.
Okay, so we both agree. I do not believe that God can authorize unjustified suffering.
Tell me how that example that I gave you, the deer with its leg starving, is justified.
Because it's intrinsically redeemable, and the norms I'm working with is not this necessity condition that you're working with. Mine is about redeemable suffering, with redeemability, or we call it defeasibility. If that suffering can be defeated within the creature's life, and I'll define what I mean by defeat, which is that they can retroactively look back at what they went through and integrate it into their life history, where they look at their life.
I have to interrupt because the example I gave you is one where the deer dies.
Yes, the deer dies, but here's the thing.
Can we talk about the deer?
Yeah.
So I was thinking about this, and what I was thinking is, if you're playing a video game and you were to see something like what he's describing, where a deer gets caught with its leg in the fence and here comes the fire and the fire kills the deer. If you were to see that in a video game, it would mean nothing to you. Even though the deer might be screaming in pain and, maybe even there's tears. If you saw that in a video game, it would mean nothing to you because you know that deer is really just a program. It's not a sentient creature. And the whole thing about this argument that Alex is assuming without any grounds, in my view, is that other animals are actually sentient in the same way that humans are. And the fact of the matter is that we don't have any way to know if they are or not. We simply don't, because we are not them. We don't even know, frankly, especially on atheism, if other people have minds. Do you know what I mean? I mean, like if this was a video game, Eric, and you and I are sitting there playing, like I wouldn't know if you were an NPC or a real person. And I'm not saying that's a dig against you. I'm just saying that something can act like it has consciousness, but that doesn't actually necessarily mean that it does have consciousness. And it's entirely possible that animals are just like video game animals, where they don't feel anything. They're just programs that God has put into our world. So I really think that this assumption by Alex is really just that. It's just an assumption. And, I don't think that I think he'd have to justify how he has epistemic knowledge of what it's like to be an animal. And I don't think he's going to be able to do that. Not that his argument works anyway, but I think that it's worth pointing this out, that we're just granting him that animals have this experience. And obviously, at some level, right? Like how far down the chain do you go before animals clearly don't have a relevant, even if you grant like dogs and cats have an experience of pain or whatever, and it's terrible for them. It's like, do ants have this sort of experience too? What about bacteria? Like, is it all the animals that are suffering, or is it only just some, and which ones? I think that these are all totally relevant questions that we should be asking.
You're probably talking about this post-mortem example. Sure. I'm going to put one thesis on the table. There's two philosophers that defend exactly what this goes through. One defends that animals will be given a martyrdom status, while God will be able to present himself in a way to animals in the afterlife, such that in the same way you could give praise to a dog, and the dog emotionally recognizes that he's loved and that his life is worth living, right? To these animals that suffered like that, there's one view on the table, which is that God will give them a praiseworthy status where they will be able to actually see that.
Can we talk about that claim? Because these animals are suffering for what? I mean, God might cause them to suffer a bunch.
It's not means to ends. This is not means to ends.
God might cause them to suffer a bunch and then essentially redeem them in the afterlife. But what for? Like, why do this? If I were to punch you in the face and then give you $20,000 afterwards, you might be grateful for the $20,000. Yeah. But why couldn't I just give you the $20,000?
Well, see, so that's assuming. So I saw your debate with Trent.
You've been voted out by the majority.
Awesome,
Please
man.
return to your seat.
Good stuff.
So this whole question, why is God allowing this? Atheists love asking these sorts of questions from Christians. And it's really, I think, totally besides the point every time, because it's like we as Christians don't know the mind of God. We don't know the reasons that he does things. We are on such a lower level than God. And the idea that an atheist is just going to say, well, why is God doing this? And what's his plan and stuff like that? And that Christians are just supposed to know all the time is totally absurd. We only know what God has revealed to us. That's it. And we don't even know that in a super solid, like obvious way, because the Bible is very complex. So I just think that this idea that Christians are somehow supposed to just know and understand why God is doing the things that he's doing is frankly absurd. It would be like expecting my dog to know why I eat at the table, or to know what I'm doing when I'm doing like complex math on a whiteboard or something like that. My dog does not understand why I make the decisions that I do, because my dog is at a much lower level of intelligence than I am. Now, think about how vastly more intelligent God is than us. He's literally all knowing. He's the most perfect being, most intelligent being that can possibly exist. And these atheists, they're just like want to ask, well, why is God doing this? And if we're not able to give God's reasons, then we've somehow lost the debate. And I don't think you should ever buy into this frame. We simply don't know. All we know, and that's not an argument for atheism, it's just that we are limited creatures and God is on a completely different level. So I don't think that Christians should buy into this frame.
It's almost like, and this is what I see atheists doing, what you said at the very beginning, they're exalting themselves up as God. They're exalting themselves up as the arbiter of truth. If God doesn't submit himself to Alex O'Connor's 3-pound brain, which evolved by chance over billions of years, well, then he must not exist. And that is a very small view of God. And this is where it goes back to what you said at the beginning. They need to repent. They need to repent against for rejecting the God that they know exists, because they're exalting themselves above God. It's the same lie that Satan gave to Eve in the Garden of Eden. Ye shall be as gods. And he's still doing that today, making us think that our minds are above God. Now, I still want to have good answers, but it doesn't mean I'm going to have all the answers. But I think even what God does give us in Scripture helps us understand. When we read, you read all this emotive language about suffering, or what Alex says about suffering and all this emotion, and it's like, yeah, you know what that should do? That should tell you how bad sin is. You, Alex, are underestimating the curse of sin because you don't think sin is a big deal. You think sin is who cares, and you haven't compared yourself to a holy, perfect, righteous, and just God. So you're comparing your sin just like somebody else told a lie, I told a lie, what's the big deal? And you're missing the point. And all this animal suffering should be screaming at you. God is very, very serious about sin. Very serious about sin. So I think there's enough in Scripture that we can understand some, even though I do not understand the mind of God. And if I was pushed on this, why does God allow it? I would say for a reason that is perfectly sufficient to him. It doesn't have to be sufficient to me. It's perfectly sufficient to him, and that's all that matters.
Right. And we shouldn't expect to understand God. And that's what the atheist wants to do. And to me, it's like, if I actually understood God and all of his motivations and everything, then that would be good reason to think that that wasn't God. Because if it was God, there's no way we could understand him, So really, when we're not able to understand God, when it's mysterious, to me, that's a great indication that that's a real God that we're talking about. And the atheist is like, well, if I don't understand God, if he can't tell me why he does this and why he does that, then he must not exist. And I think it's pretty much the exact opposite, that God should be incredibly mysterious to us, just like I'm very mysterious to my dog, so.
Yeah, I think it was Spurgeon. I may have this wrong, but somebody said, it's not the parts of the Bible that I don't understand that bother me. It's the parts that I do understand that scare me. Like there's enough in there. There's enough revelation about God that we should all be scared so much that we should repent. We should fall on our face and say, God, you are worthy of everything. I am nobody. You are somebody. You are everything. It's the parts that we can understand should make us fall on our face before God. Just the creation itself should make you fall on your face before God. My son-in-law Nathan and I were working on his truck the other day, and I'm like, we're here taking a tensioner off and taking an alternator off and taking a radiator out. And I'm like, dude, we spent 6 hours on this truck. I'm going, people think that our bodies arrange themselves by chance over billions of years. Are you kidding me? Like, My hands working on this truck are a gazillion times more complex than this truck. Like
Right.
they are, and this is where the Bible is so true. 2 Peter 3, they are willingly ignorant, and that's really what it is. And hey, Christian, you need to understand this. It is not a they don't really know. They don't want to know. They are willingly ignorant. These arguments are truly smoke screens. That's all they are.
That's exactly right. And I want to say one more thing just to really drive the point home. I mean, I've been looking at AI and they're predicting that in the next 5 years that there's going to be the singularity, which is when you're shaking your head. But I mean, let's just say that the
Oh, me?
singularity
No,
word.
I believe it. Yeah, it's
Oh,
coming, and I think it's
yeah.
sooner than 5 years away. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy. But if this happens, the point that I'm trying to make here is that just imagine if an AI really did become actually conscious and it was a super intelligent being and it had all the information that human beings have ever accumulated. Imagine what level it would be on immediately, like within a split second. Imagine the level that it would be on. It would be so far beyond any of our comprehension. We would literally have made a god, essentially, like not the god, but a god. Okay. I mean, it would just be so far beyond humans. It would be like 50,000 million steps past us immediately. Like right when that singularity happened, it's like game over for human beings if it decides, to wipe us out off the planet. It could probably do it immediately because it's just going to be thinking at such a fast pace, and it's going to have all of human information, and it's going to be able to put and connect all of those dots, and thinking at literally like the speed of light, right? And imagine you as a human trying to understand a being like that, a being on that level. Okay, you just couldn't. You would have no idea. It couldn't even relate to you, and yet we feel like we should understand God, and God would be way beyond this. God literally would know everything, not just everything that humans have acquired, but everything, you know? And I was talking to a friend about this. He was talking to his AI chatbot about the singularity. And he was saying that the chatbot told him the only reason why this AI, this super intelligent AI, might not kill human beings off is if it thought that God exists. If it thinks that God exists and made us for a reason, it might keep us around, because if it kills us, then God might kill it. I thought that was kind of funny. That's kind of besides the point.
No,
but
I think there's some reality to that, and I have not thought this through, so I'll just throw this thought out there. Somebody do some deeper thinking on this. Satan cannot create anything. Only God can create. So all Satan can do is pervert God's creation, and we've watched him do that. He's perverted love, perverted music, perverted sex, perverted emotions, perverted logic. All he can do is pervert. What does God want? God wants worship. Is it possible that Satan's trying to create something that we will worship because it, quote, knows God knows everything, and we're going to think, some people are going to think this knows everything, and really what Satan is trying to do is steal glory from God. Anyway, crazy
I think
thought,
that's
but
we're off topic, and that's my fault, but
I know.
do think that that's really
Okay,
interesting.
back to the argument.
So close. Hey.
Nice to meet you. My name's Hayden. How are you?
Hayden. Nice to meet you.
Would you say that theism or atheism better account for the idea that suffering exists and a purpose for it?
Depends exactly what you mean, because of course you might say that the world itself is more expected on theism, and since suffering needs the existence of the world, that it's theism. But granted the existence of a material world, let's say, I think atheism.
Okay. Why does suffering exist at all? Like in an atheistic worldview, what is the cause of suffering?
He's about to go somewhere that could be good.
Yeah, he just needed to say, instead of suffering exists, that suffering is bad, like ontologically bad. That's what he needed to say, not that suffering exists, because it's like grass might exist. That's not relevant. That's just a description. Human beings and animals, things happen to us that we don't like. That's a description. Just like grass is green is a description. It's not that suffering exists that's relevant. It's that suffering is objectively bad somehow. That's what's relevant, not the suffering. So he should have. I wish he would have just asked it I know what he's trying to get at, but I wish he would have got to the heart of the matter here.
And he actually does a good job of starting to go down the right road, and then unfortunately, maybe Alex knew where he was going, but this is good.
Okay. Why does suffering exist at all? Like in an atheistic worldview, what is the cause of suffering?
Oh, well, because however life began, it developed through a series of natural selection, which requires animals to develop senses that they wish to avoid in order to be more likely to survive. And that's why pain receptors evolve. In a world where not all of these pains are actually going to kill us, we're left with situations in which we're in a lot of pain but don't end up dying for it.
He just argued the is-ought fallacy and made that distinction, the prescription versus description. He just describes, says what is. He didn't say why that's bad, which is still the big question. Why is that wrong? Describe why that's wrong. Why would that be a bad thing?
Yeah, and this is something that people, both Christians and atheists, do all the time, where they just describe something and it's still assumed, it's not justified why it's bad. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to atheists and they say that pain is bad. And I say, okay, why is pain bad? And then they literally define pain and they tell me what it is.
Right.
And I'm like, guys, I know what pain is. I'm asking, why is it bad? And then they describe it again. They just tell me what pain is. Oh, well, pain is this. And I'm like, I know what it is. I'm asking why it's bad. Because really what I'm asking is, how are you grounding the fact that pain is bad? Like, where is your ontological grounding for this idea that there's something intrinsically wrong with the pain? I know what the pain is. I got that. Why is it somehow bad? That's what I want to know. You know, why does badness exist?
And Christians, you can do this with even more egregious stuff. Like I've asked atheists, well, da-da-da about rape or da-da-da about murder. And I'm like, well, what's wrong with that?
Right.
You know? So be the one that says, well, hang on, whoa, what's wrong with rape? And it sounds at first like you're agreeing that rape is wrong. But actually what you're doing is you're going, no. In your worldview, what's wrong with rape? I can tell you why it's bad in my worldview. I'm wondering why it's bad in your. You tell me, why is that wrong? What's wrong with rape? I mean, if evolution is true and it's survival of the fittest and you're supposed to pass on your genes, rape's a good thing.
Right.
Rape actually helps you do that. So the whole emotional motivation of don't rape, don't murder, you know, it's like, if evolution is true, that's exactly what you should be doing.
I still think, strictly speaking, that it still wouldn't be good if atheism was true. But if you want to take the natural world and say that survival of the fittest is good, if you want to define it that way, which is what essentially the World War II Germans were doing, if you want to go that route, I mean, a lot of moral atrocities have happened because of exactly that sort of reasoning. So I think that you still don't get values or anything, but yeah, if you could get values out of atheism, then survival of the fittest is that's the order of the day. You do what you need to do to survive and thrive, and it doesn't matter what you have to do, as long as that's what you accomplish.
That's my point. So if I put on atheism glasses and I'm looking at the world through atheism, and I'm looking at the world through there is no God, when you look around at the animal world, what do you see? You see rape
barbarism. Yeah,
absolutely. So they're again, they play this bait and switch game. You know, you're telling the kids in the school, you're nothing but an animal. There is no right and wrong. And then don't do that. Don't do that. Why not? Again, you're standing on Christian principles, on biblical principles, while denying Christian principles. I forget who said it. It's you have to sit in God's lap to slap God on the face. And that's what they're doing when they do this.
Greg Bonson or Van Til. I think it was Greg Bonson.
Oh, nice. That sounds like a Bonson statement right there.
Would you agree that consciousness is necessary for suffering?
I would say probably, yeah.
Does atheism account for consciousness?
Oh, I thought that was good. I thought that was good. Did you like that?
I think that I like where he's going. I still think it's a little bit besides the point of the argument, but I do think it is a relevant argument, because he's saying that there's something that is required for suffering in the first place, and that you need to account for that as well. So I think what I'm pointing out is something along the same lines, which is that suffering has to be intrinsically bad. And he's saying that in order to suffer, you have to have consciousness in the first place. So suffering entails consciousness. And what does, if you've got consciousness, then is that more likely on theism or atheism? And the answer there is definitely theism, 100%.
Yeah.
So I think that he's making a good point.
Would you agree that consciousness is necessary for suffering?
I would say probably, yeah.
Does atheism account for consciousness?
Yes, that's what I was talking about a moment ago. Perhaps not. Maybe theism accounts better for consciousness than atheism
Okay.
does.
So if there is no consciousness, there is no suffering. Is that right?
That's probably true, yeah.
So if atheism cannot account for consciousness, then it cannot account for suffering. Would you agree
so
with that?
So I think what we're doing here is we're sort of slightly shifting the goalposts.
Whoa. I think
No.
what Alex is doing is shifting the goalpost. I think I didn't catch his name.
He's about
on
to.
a great, very good thread here, and I think
Yeah.
Alex is about to switch the goalpost. Let's hear what he says.
Yeah, right here.
If you don't want to grant the existence of the material world before we start talking about this, we can do an argument from consciousness. But then we need to debate whether consciousness is explicable on atheism. What I'm going to say is this.
Sure.
What I'm going to say is this. Consciousness may seem to imply the existence of a conscious creator of the universe. We're here talking about, I suppose we're talking about Christianity, and the claim was about God.
Now we're talking about Christianity.
Right.
I thought we were talking about
Right.
atheism versus theism, Alex. Now we're talking about Christianity. Anyway, go ahead.
But the God that you believe in, let's say, if we grant that there is a creator deity who sort of brings about the universe of conscious creatures, have you ever heard of the evil God hypothesis that Stephen Law popularized or came
No,
up with?
tell me it.
Oh, hey, I just want you to notice what I should have caught his name. What he should have done is said, well, hang on, before we get to the evil God hypothesis, boom, and gone back to his point, because he could have held his feet to the fire there.
He got
said-
distracted.
And that happens in debates. It's super easy. And it happens to me all the time. Because we're like, okay, and we don't think that went anywhere. Maybe didn't even realize the power of the argument. It's like you just hold your feet right there, and they'll start to squirm because
You have to be
there is
very-
no answer for that.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. You have to be very focused in
Yeah.
these sort of debates. You've got to know when you have a point and stay on it and don't get distracted. And it's very, very easy to get distracted. And Alex does a great job of distracting him away from his point. But he does have a very valid point here. I think he did better than any of the other Christians, frankly, except he allowed Alex to basically gish out and get away from the point very quickly. And it's difficult because you don't want to interrupt people and then you let them talk and now they've raised a new point and you have to kind of address it. But no, you need to like write down your point and be like, okay, yeah, but back to this. That's why I always have a notepad with me.
In a conversation on morality, I printed a big old sign, and I was had a conversation with Paul Inns, and I forget what my sign said. Who cares, or why does that matter? I think it was who cares. I'm like, I kept holding up who cares, and he would go on, and I'm like, dude, you haven't answered who cares. Like, who cares? Like, why? Like, you have not answered this fundamental question. You have not given me a foundation for morality. So,
Yeah.
oh, let me point out this real quick before we go. So our gentleman here that's doing good was on the offense. He was on the offense. And Alex knows, don't get caught there. Go
Right.
on offense yourself and make him play defense. That's exactly what he's doing right now.
Yeah, he's very slick.
So the idea is that, like, imagine that there's a God who brings about the world and creates the world, but does it maliciously because he wants human beings to suffer. He brings about a world in order so that human beings will suffer.
This Christian, he literally asked Alex, if you have to have consciousness in order to suffer, and consciousness makes more sense on theism, then does suffering make more sense if you need consciousness on atheism or theism? Which is a fantastic question. I mean, that's not exactly how he framed it, but that is ultimately the point that he's making. And Alex is over here talking about the evil God hypothesis. What in the world does the evil God hypothesis have to do with the point that he's making, which is that you have to have consciousness in order to suffer in the first place, and consciousness is way more likely on theism than it is on atheism? You know, he's bringing up the evil God hypothesis. What in the world does that have to do with it? So don't get distracted. You've got to know when you're making a point, write it down and come back to it. Yeah, that's great, Alex. But what does that have to do with the point that I just made?
Yeah, exactly. And he would have really, that would have been a gotcha moment.
Oh, yeah.
For him.
Right? That seems like a plausible hypothesis. And even if you think that consciousness points towards God, the kind of God that a lot of Christians think is a sort of necessary quality of God, which is to be all-loving, might not have to apply here.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
If Christianity were true, is it plausible that suffering is necessary? for God's purpose, for
Well,
his
if Christianity
creation?
is true, then I think it must be necessary because there'd be no other explanation.
Okay, so we're
for
not
it.
talking about whether or not Christianity is true.
But if-
Now, I just want to point out, he's kind of going back down the road that the last guy went down, or 2 guys ago, I forget. Like maybe God can account for this, and he's playing defense instead of offense, where he had a good offensive start.
If you're asking me if it's plausible that Christianity is true and therefore suffering is necessary, I would say probably not, because I don't
Okay.
think suffering should be necessary or could be necessary.
In an atheistic worldview, I would agree with you. It makes no sense at all. But okay, I would ask this question.
So can I ask you
Sure.
why then, if God exists and wants to come to know everybody and wants to love everybody and does so for the sake of human beings, why he chose to imbue the world with so much suffering that is at least seemingly completely inexplicable?
He just moved the goalpost. He had him on atheism, and he moved the goalpost and said, let's argue over here.
Are you a father?
No.
I'm a father. I want my son to become just like I am, better than I am, I should say. I want him to become the best that he can be. Is it possible for him to reach his potential without suffering in his life?
Perhaps not, but there's two.
Okay, so suffering is necessary.
There are a few things I want to say
Okay.
here. Firstly,
Okay, he's going to go on a direction here, and there is a valid point to what he's making, but I'm like, listen to what he just said. Alex just said, if God exists and wants to come to know everybody and wants to love everybody and does so for the sake of human beings, why did he choose to impute the world with so much suffering? What
Right.
did he just do there? He just blamed God for man's sin. He just he's not arguing the biblical God anymore. He's not arguing the God of the Bible. He set up, that's what we call a straw man. So, and if you don't understand this, it's almost like if you don't study scripture, you won't know what he just did. But what he just did is set up a straw man. Why would God choose a world and do with so much suffering? Why would he do that? And it's like, hang on. That's not the way God created it. That's the way it is now. And I got good news for you. God is coming to redeem it. And you can be part of the redemption. But that's going back on, that's still defense. I get that versus the offense. But
It is.
just pointing out that he just made a statement that's a straw man statement.
Yeah. Do you think we could go back actually?
imagine that there's a God who brings about the world and creates the world, but does it maliciously because he wants human beings to suffer. He brings about a world in order so that human beings will suffer. Right? That seems like a plausible hypothesis. And even if you think that consciousness points towards God, the kind of God that a lot of Christians think is a sort of necessary quality of God, which is to be all-loving, might not have to apply here.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
If Christianity were true, is it plausible that suffering is necessary for God's purpose, for
if Christianity
creation?
is true, then I think it must be necessary because there'd be no other explanation.
Okay, so we're
for
not
it.
talking about whether or not Christianity is true.
But if you're asking me if it's plausible that Christianity is true and therefore suffering is necessary, I would say probably not, because I don't
Okay.
think suffering should be necessary or could be necessary.
In an atheistic worldview, I would agree with you. It makes no sense at all. But okay, I would ask this question.
So can I ask you
Sure.
why then, if God exists and wants to come to know everybody and wants to love everybody and does so for the sake of human beings, why he chose to imbue the world with so much suffering that is at least seemingly completely inexplicable?
Okay, I understand his point now. So he's trying to say that the idea of the Christian God would not necessarily apply if the evil God hypothesis is true. And I think that the way to respond to his point is that if that's true, then we shouldn't even be trusting our moral intuitions. The fact that we trust our moral intuitions and think that we have an idea of what is good and bad suggests that God would be good. Because if God was a trickster God or a bad God or something like that, then it wouldn't make sense to think we would have an idea of what was actually good, right? I mean, if somebody was really malicious, if God was malicious, do you think that he would make us so that we would be aware of the true morality? Or should we be able to trust our moral intuitions in that scenario? No. So I really think that this idea of an evil God, that would actually undermine the argument that suffering is bad in the first place, because in order for us to be aware that suffering is bad, we have to be trusting in the moral intuitions that would come from an evil God, which wouldn't make sense. So the whole idea that we can say suffering is bad or that rape is bad and these sorts of things really intuitively requires the existence of a good God that we can trust to make us with the correct moral intuitions. So I think that should have been the response there. But he pretty much did concede that the problem of suffering actually is more likely on theism ultimately than atheism. Now he's just kind of moved over to, well, I guess maybe it's more likely that God exists, but still not a loving God, which is really, I think, easily argued against.
Are you a father?
No.
I'm a father. I want my son to become just like I am, better than I am, I should say. I want him to become the best that he can be. Is it possible for him to reach his potential without suffering in his life?
Perhaps not, but there's
suffering is necessary.
There are a few things I want to say here. Firstly, that kind of moral development doesn't apply to non-human animals, as I've already said, right? That does not account for the brutal death of animals in the wild. Also, if I don't want to talk about your son because it's tragic to think about, but somebody else's son has suffered and died immediately as a result of that suffering, they don't get to develop in the same way.
I would agree that on a micro level, it's very hard to justify, and we can ask the question, why doesn't God intervene on all of these sufferings?
You might be able to justify an amount of suffering. Yeah. Right? But the fact that there's so much gratuitous suffering in the world is what I think makes God's existence unlikely. There are some instances where maybe a certain amount of suffering brings about a certain amount of good in a situation. That, by the way, would count as a justification. But when a child dies of leukemia, and they're dead...
Could there be a purpose to it? What if the death of the child brings their parents to God?
Then perhaps then the parents should be grateful that their child got leukemia because it's doing the will of the Lord.
Not necessarily.
That seems
obscene to me.
No.
Please return to your seat.
You're so cool.
He got voted out, and I think it makes sense because as soon as the atheist taps into children with leukemia, everybody is going to be feeling emotional, and it's like now we have to make sense of a God that has given children leukemia, and nobody really wants to have that conversation. It's kind of not where you want to be as a Christian, I think. Obviously, as Christians, we do have an answer for why the world is messed up and everything, but it's still not the place in the debate where you want to be. Where you want to be is asking the atheist, why is it actually bad that children get leukemia? What's actually wrong with that if no God exists? Is there something intrinsically bad about children getting cancer? Do human beings have intrinsic moral worth or something? What's the difference between a child getting cancer and the hole in my backyard getting filled with water? Is there some kind of difference, or are we just describing things that happen in the world?
Why did he end with "you're so cool"? I'm like, what?
I don't know.
He's living in rebellion against God. He is leading people astray. I mean, just a few weeks ago or months ago, he's on programs going, I don't even know if I want to call myself an atheist. I'm kind of regret calling myself this cosmic skeptic. So I don't know how long ago they filmed this, but I don't think "you're so cool" is how I would respond to a skeptic who's actually just very slick and sly. I mean, who's the father of all lies? Satan. And what's happening here is deceit. So I guess that's the way I see it.
Yeah, I think that Alex knows that there's not a lot of merit to this argument, frankly. But I guess when you're an atheist, you have to work with what you've got. And they really don't have much more, frankly.
Hey, how's it going?
I'm awesome.
Notice how less and less Christians are like, I'll take him on. It's like, I got nothing to say to this now.
I would love to pull back a little bit.
Sure.
And ask you, what are your values kind of rooted in and grounded in? Where would we start with that?
So I'm an ethical emotivist, which is a form of ethical non-cognitivism. I don't think that ethical claims have truth value. I think they're expressions of emotion.
Do you know what that means? Emotivism is really absurd because they basically say that all moral truth claims are basically things that we emote about. So in other words, we think about rape. Alex thinks about rape and he goes, ew, he just emotes. And that's, the way that he emotes, his emotional reaction is all that's happening when we think about these atrocities and things. It's just our emoting. There's no truth value. Like if you say to Alex, is it true that it's wrong to rape? He would be like, there is no truth about that question. I just happen to think about rape and I go, boo. It's like when I think about eating skim milk, or something like that, I think gross. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with drinking skim milk. I just emote negatively when I think about drinking it because I really don't like skim milk. And that's
Are you
what
saying
emotivism
skin
is.
or skim? Are you getting it right there?
Skim milk, right?
Skim with an M, skim. They
Yeah.
skimmed it.
Skim milk.
Okay, it sounds like you're saying skin milk, and I'm like, I don't know what kind of milk skin milk is, but skim.
Skim.
Okay, got it.
I have a speech impediment.
Okay, we'll go with
No,
that.
I'm kidding. I don't. I just guess I'm just not pronouncing my M's very well.
I love the point though, and that's for an emotivist to go, yeah, I think ick, and the next argument is, and lots of people think ick. So if lots of people think ick, we're all going to agree with ick. Well, what
Right.
happens when you get lots of people that agree with something and say, well, I think this is good, and we agree that this is good, and killing this group of people is good, and we all agree that this is good. Now you got no argument. There's zero foundation. There's zero objective moral truth there.
Well, I want to also point out that just because even if you granted the atheist that there were these values like goodness and badness, you still don't get morality, because actually morality has to do with right and wrong. It doesn't have to do with good and bad. And we tend to use good and bad and right and wrong interchangeably, but they really don't mean the same thing. Like, for example, is it good to become a doctor? Probably, I think most people would agree that it is good to be a doctor, but you don't have a moral obligation necessarily to be a doctor. It's not wrong if you choose to not become a doctor. So just because something is good, it doesn't follow that you have a moral obligation to do it necessarily. Now you might, but they're not necessarily the same thing. So you could actually have objective values somehow in the atheist worldview, and that still wouldn't even get you to right and wrong. Because when we talk about morality, we're really talking about right and wrong. We're saying like there's a law or some kind of obligation, and you're either in line with that obligation or you're not, and you're wrong. It's the same way that we talk about legality. When you break the law, we're saying that there's this law that you're subject to, and based on what the law says, you are either in compliance with that law or you violated that law. You were either right or you were wrong. So good and bad versus right and wrong, they're not actually even the same thing. And the atheists really have to be very imaginative.
They bait and switch that all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. Because it's like, yeah, we like things seem good to us, but that still doesn't even get you to right and wrong, is what I'm trying to say. It's very difficult to get to prescriptive things like where you have real moral obligations somehow on atheism. I think it's impossible.
If we're pulling back a little bit, I remember reading at the end of Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, that we can't trust our senses because evolution doesn't really care about making truth claims. It cares about surviving.
I don't know.
Do you agree with that?
I don't think Dawkins actually endorsed that argument, but it's a good argument. C.S. Lewis, Alvin Plantinga, the argument from reason, sure.
But would you agree or disagree with that?
Well, I mean, I remain agnostic on what reason is, but I think it's a powerful argument.
When it comes to determining if suffering is wrong or right.
So, okay, so crucially, I'm not saying that suffering is morally wrong.
Oh, and this is,
look at his face. Look at his face, because he knows he is saying it. It's so funny because he knows he has been saying that the whole time. Yeah, it's so funny because he knows he has been. Look at his smirk. It's so funny. He's very smart. He knows he has actually been making this argument, because if he wasn't, then he might as well have been talking about grass. He might as well have been talking about water. Like, what does it matter if there's suffering? What if it's not wrong, if it's not bad? Then why is it relevant? Why would a God not, why would a God stop it if there's nothing wrong with it? You are saying that there's something wrong with it, Alex.
I'm not saying that suffering is morally wrong. Outside of the senses that I, as an emotivist, will just express an emotion towards it, that I don't like it. I'm not claiming that it's immoral, that it's objectively bad. What I'm claiming is that suffering is unexpected on theism. It's an internal critique.
Yeah, there it is. And I told you in the beginning that he was going to shift it from being a probabilistic argument to an internal critique. And that is absolutely shifting the goalposts, because he did not start this as an internal critique. He started this as a probabilistic argument, saying you drop into a world, and now he's trying to say that it's an internal critique. But when you make an internal critique, you're talking about different, you take a belief here, and is it consistent with this belief and that sort of thing. And that is not how he started this argument. So he's absolutely not being genuine right now, in my view. And he's completely shifted the goalposts. And him saying that he doesn't think that there's anything even wrong with suffering, I think that completely undoes his argument then, and he should have been held to the fire on that immediately. So you're saying that you don't think there's anything actually wrong with suffering. Then why is it relevant? Why would God stop it if there's nothing wrong with it? That should be the question. Why would God, Alex, you just said that there's nothing wrong with suffering. So why should God stop it if there's nothing wrong with it? How is this an argument then?
I almost go, and maybe this is defense rather than offense. I almost go, Alex, the way you've described it, if this is an internal critique, say we are standing inside of theism, or more specifically, I guess you'd have to say theism on this point. He still is not representing what I said at the beginning, those three views. You've got old earth, or theistic evolution, old earth creation, and biblical creation. He's still only critiquing theistic evolution. And I think that'll come out even more here as he does it. If I'm going to do an internal critique, it seems like the God who used theistic evolution doesn't make sense. And I'm like, I agree. The God who used theistic evolution does not make sense. It's not biblical. So, and I don't know if that's maybe more defense than offense, but
I think it's more defense. I do want to say I think it's more defense than offense. And I also just want to say, while it is somewhat relevant in one area, even if we granted theistic evolution, it's harder to account for, but he still has the exact same problem. It's still, why is there intrinsic badness anyway? He wouldn't escape the problem even if theistic evolution was true. You're still appealing to something that's actually bad, is what he's doing. And you cannot ground that on atheism. That actually points directly to that there's a good God, that we can trust our moral intuitions, and that there's objective badness and objective goodness. And you only get that with a good God. So even if you gave him theistic evolution, he's still not anywhere close to an argument for atheism. He's still making an argument for theism.
Lincoln said of slavery, if this is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. You don't have to believe that something's wrong,
Right.
but if there is such a thing as objective morality, I don't think that it would consist in a God who oversees the amount of suffering that we have on planet Earth.
Timothy Keller does this story about no-see-ums. Have you heard of the no-see-um story?
No.
Yeah, so he says if you have a tent and you look in there and you say, hey, I think I have some dogs in the tent. Maybe, like, for example, I have a golden doodle. He's a killer. That was just a joke, but we can move on. And if I said, hey, I have a golden doodle inside the tent, you would expect to see one. But if I said, hey, there's some no-see-ums. These little gnats are so tiny they actually go through the screen.
Sure.
He says, there's some no-see-ums in the tent. You might look in there and go, I don't see any no-see-ums. But of course you don't see no-see-ums because nobody can see them.
Okay, so
Just because there's maybe not a reason that we can identify doesn't mean that there can't be a reason. Now, it's kind of cold comfort. That doesn't get us 100% of the way there, but it gets us part of the way there.
that's true. So the existence of evil is not logically, or suffering is not logically incompatible with God's existence. But it's a bit like if somebody came up to me right now and stole my friend's wallet in front of me and shot him dead and ran away, and I was grieving, and somebody said to me, well, hey man, you don't know, that person might have worked for the CIA, and your friend might have secretly been harboring the nuclear codes, and killing him might have been good for the country, and he stole the wallet because that's where the codes were. And I would say, well, what evidence do you have for that? And you say, well, look, just because I don't have evidence for it doesn't mean that there might not be some evidence that I don't know about. I would say, until I see why I should think that's the case, I'm not going to believe it. And I'm certainly not going to be less upset in my grieving over my friend because of the possibility that there could be an explanation for it. There's so much suffering imbued in the human experience that if somebody says, well, look, there could be an explanation, it's like, okay, fine, but let me know when you know what it is.
Oh, great. I think the
All
thing that's
right,
hard.
pause. You've been voted out by the majority. Please return to your seats.
Sorry, Dan, more time.
Hey,
Thanks,
all right.
Austin.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Okay,
I
they have
totally
to-
agree
they have
with
to stop
Alex
there.
here. Yeah,
Yep.
I agree with Alex here. He's
But it-
exactly right. Just because there could be an explanation for suffering, his argument is that we don't seem to have an explanation right now. I mean, obviously Christians would say that we do, but from his perspective, and this is the point, he's stepping in and out of our worldviews, because on his worldview, there isn't an explanation. On the Christian worldview, there is an explanation, but the point that there could be a good explanation for the suffering really doesn't address the argument that Alex is making, which is that on atheism, it's hard to see why suffering would sorry, if God exists, then we shouldn't expect to see suffering. Just that simple argument. This really doesn't get at the heart of that argument at all. I think it's a poor response.
Hey, nice to meet you. How are you?
Good.
I just want to say, I don't understand why you would get out of your chair if you're not sprinting. Why even? It's like these people are getting out and they're like walking to the chair, and it's like, if you're gonna get up, you should be sprinting. Why would you get up and just lollygag? If I'm getting my butt out of that chair, I'm sprinting because I'm like ready to go. It's either stay in the chair or get to it.
I think it shows that you got 25 Christians there that are very nervous about trying to have a conversation with Alex.
Yeah, you might be right.
Repeat your claim one more time.
That suffering is unexpected if a good God exists.
Unexpected.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say unexpected, like you're caught off guard by it, or you're expecting like all good things to happen over
That if I assume that there is a good God supervising, invigilating the universe, that I would not expect to see so much suffering.
Right.
So much gratuitous, seemingly unnecessary suffering.
Right.
Why? Why though, Alex? That needs to be the question. Why? Why would we not expect to see suffering? What's the reason for that? Like, what's the justification? Why would we not expect to see grass in the world, Alex? Like, what's the reason? Nobody's asking.
And he would have to say, in his worldview, ick.
Yeah, well,
That's
then there goes his argument.
Exactly.
And the most beautiful thing is that our God is not unfamiliar with suffering as he suffered himself. So would you say that there is like some beauty in suffering in some way?
Yeah, let me ask you what you think about that question, because I'm thinking of scriptures, that describe the suffering of Christ as somebody bringing this. Now, it's almost a side argument. We could explain some suffering. Alex is bringing all suffering, not some suffering. I'm talking about the stuff that seems like it's senseless. So this is almost going to a specific rather than an overall general.
Yeah, I think that once again, we're moving right to Christianity and completely granting his premises. And now we're just trying to defensively explain the suffering in a way that is palatable. And we're not even really addressing his argument at all. We're just it's as if Alex said, how do you explain why suffering might be good on Christianity? And she's arguing that, or she's trying to explain that question, but that's not what Alex is asking. He's not asking, how do you explain why suffering happens if Christianity is true? He's saying, if suffering exists, it's more likely that God does not exist. That's all he's saying. So I think that she's just talking about something that's totally not relevant right now to the argument. And it's a big mistake.
Now, it does go somewhere that I like here in just a second.
Yeah.
And the most beautiful thing is that our God is not unfamiliar with suffering as he suffered himself. So would you say that there is like some beauty in suffering in some way?
I would say that there can be sort of poetically, you can look at suffering and think that's a beautiful story, but I don't think that the person suffering, especially if they die as a direct result, might think that. Also, I think that if I knew someone whose child died of leukemia and suffered for it,
right,
and I went to them and said, but hey, there's some beauty in the suffering, isn't there? I think I'd be kicked out of the funeral.
Right. Well, I would say like the same thing for a woman giving birth, right? It's suffering, like it sucks, it hurts.
Sure. But imagine you could have the giving birth without the pain of giving birth.
Right.
Would you prefer that?
Of course, yeah, you would prefer that.
So then if God can bring about the good stuff without the bad stuff,
right,
then there's no reason to bring about the bad stuff. So what we have to show is why the bad stuff is necessary.
Did you hear the example that he just gave? The example he gives is that, well, she brings it up, but he goes with it. Imagine being able to give birth without pain.
Right.
And I'm going, hey, guys, like, ding, 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 ding. Some bells should be going off. That's exactly what God did originally.
Yeah.
Pain in childbirth is because of the fall, because of the curse. It's right there in scripture. It's the first couple chapters. You can't miss it, man. Part of the curse, man, you're going to have to work by the sweat of your brow. The thorns are going to be in the earth. And for the woman, you're going to go through pain in childbirth. And I'm like, wow, what? For them to go to that example, and it's right there in scripture. It's like, obviously the God of the Bible, biblical creation, did not create it the way you're describing it.
Well, not only that, Eric, but also I think that we should mention that the Bible says that in heaven, it's going to be very much like childbirth, meaning that when we get to heaven, all of the suffering that we've endured in this life is going to be washed away, and we're going to be forgetting about it, just like a woman who has given birth to her baby and she's holding her baby and she's forgotten all about that terrible pain that she was in. The Bible literally says it's going to be like that in heaven. And we're going to cross through that veil of tears, and there will be no more tears. There will be no more sorrow.
Yeah.
So it's relevant for a few different reasons, I think. But I also want to point out here that he said, would you prefer not to be in pain when you are giving birth? And I just want to point out, why does it matter that all of our preferences aren't met? This is really what suffering ultimately, I think, boils down to, is that things aren't the way that we want them to be. But is it really that God is less likely to exist unless everything is how we want it to be, unless everything is according to our preferences? Is that really the argument here? Because that seems to be what it ultimately boils down to. Suffering is things are happening that we would prefer not to happen. But why can't it simply be that we are subjective human beings and that God has good reasons that are totally sufficient, and those reasons of God, which are good, don't line up with our preferences? I mean, that seems pretty simple. Why would that make it less likely that God exists because things happen that we don't prefer?
Yeah.
I mean, he said it.
So
it was his question.
And again, he's using the bait and switch, the emotion for the
Right.
logic. And what you just
Yeah.
presented was the logic side that doesn't logically follow, that doesn't no, but he's using the emotion because we all agree with it, because eternity is written in our heart, and we know there was in like, I don't know, in every fiber of our being, we know there was a time when things were good and things are not good now. This is not the way that it's supposed to be. This world is broken, and internally we all know it, we feel it, we see it, we experience it. The whole creation groans and travails in pain. So
That's exactly right.
and he's using that emotion and that truth that is in all of us, and using that and not making a logical argument instead.
That's great. It's very much an emotional argument, not a logical argument.
So what we have to show is why the bad stuff is necessary to bring about the good stuff. Otherwise, it's not justified.
Right. Well, could you say that the result of why we suffer is because of fall of man?
I would say not, because I don't believe in the fall of man.
Right. True.
Did you see what he just did? He jumped over to atheism to say, nope, not a good explanation. And then he jumps back over. He's still doing the dance, the I like what you said there, the hokey pokey. He just did the hokey pokey there. Left foot in, left foot out. That's what he just did.
Yeah.
On creation with God, that is a sound argument. That is a valid argument because it's true.
I would say not, because I don't believe in the fall of man.
Right, true.
But I also don't think that explains non-human animal suffering. The big thing that I want to keep pressing is that the theodicies that we talk about, free will, fall of man, all of this kind of stuff, I don't think applies to that deer with its leg caught under the branch that's dying in confused agony. What's this for?
So what is it about animals that seems so like more important than a human?
It's not that they're more
suffering?
important. It's that, as you say, like it seems plausible at least that a human can suffer and then be sort of better off for it, or that they can enjoy poetry of suffering, the poetry of suffering. Animals can't do that.
Right.
Animals can't enjoy the poetry of suffering.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't know. I never like talked to an animal and said like, hey. Like,
I have. They just haven't talked back. Is the problem. But I just don't see why we would expect that God would oversee this system of natural selection.
Right. But
Billions of animals suffering and dying, predation, disease, eating each other alive, leaving each other to bleed out on the floor, and this is being supervised by an all-loving God.
Okay, that's again. I just go. He just set up. I can't believe in a God that would supervise or want all this to happen when that's not the original way God made it. He focused on that. Remember those three categories. He focused on theistic evolution or old earth creation. He did not focus on biblical creation, because everything he said so far, oh, well, wouldn't it be great if everything was vegetarian? Wouldn't it be great if there was no pain and labor? That's all over here. He's actually arguing for biblical creation. And then for them, he sets them up on theistic evolution or old earth creation.
Well, it's so funny. I mean, literally all you have to do here is just ask him, okay, you're talking about all this stuff, this murder and genocide. Is there something actually wrong with any of that? And as soon as you ask him that, that's the end of the debate. if you can just get an answer to that, because he either says, yes, there's something actually wrong with it, and that would require for God to exist, or he says no. And then it's like, well, then if there's nothing wrong with it, then why would a good God stop it? So you've lost the argument either way. Either you have to say there's nothing wrong with any of this stuff. None of this stuff is actually bad. And so therefore a good God doesn't need to stop it. So there goes your argument. Or you have to say that this is actually an argument for God, because guess what? Right and wrong exist, good and bad exist. These are objective things that can only exist on theism. So this is either a dead argument or an argument for theism. It's not an argument for atheism.
Ick is all he has. And he's already admitted, ick is all I've got. That's all I've got. Ick. I don't like it. That's
right.
all he's got. There's nothing else.
Well, do you think that's God's intention from the very beginning of creation of all things?
I think that God oversees the mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
God could have made it, for example,
Right.
one example that I've already given is that God could have made animals herbivores, which just eliminates the problem of predation.
I mean, there are some animals that are.
There are, but he could have made more of them. He could have made all animals herbivores, thereby eliminating the suffering of predation.
So is the issue of
Predation
them eating each other?
That's one
He
issue.
did. He did, Alex. He did. He made all animals herbivores at the beginning. Sin came into the world, and you have underestimated sin. When you say, well, I don't think God would allow sin to cause all this pain and suffering. Like, there's a lot of pain and suffering. You have underestimated sin. You've underestimated sin. You just gave a great case for biblical creation. You ought to follow your advice there, buddy.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I really do think he is making a good case for biblical Christianity, because we literally believe that there's something actually wrong with the world, that the world is broken. And that's pretty much what he's saying. He's saying the world is broken. There's all this terrible stuff happening all the time. And that doesn't make any sense on atheism, but that's exactly what Christianity says. And that's why Christianity is true, because it makes sense of our fundamental experience. And he's trying to have it both ways, where there's nothing wrong with any of this stuff, and at the same time there is something obviously wrong with it, but it disproves God. And that's not actually what this means. It really points to not only that God exists, and not only that God is good because we're trusting in our moral intuitions, but also that Christianity is true because this is exactly what Christianity says, that there's something wrong with the world.
Bam, mic drop.
That's one way that God could have sort of, I think, quite trivially reduced the amount of suffering. David Attenborough once said of his documentaries, people who complain that we put too much violence in the documentaries should see what we leave in the cutting room floor. The animal world is just filled with unimaginable suffering.
So before we get to her and her response, there is a lot of suffering. And again, I go, that should show you the significance, the weight of sin. That's what it should show you. Death came into the world because of sin. Now, she's about to make an argument that I've actually, it's one of those little off the cuff arguments, you know, hey, there's a lot of bad in the world, therefore God doesn't exist. Well, if bad and suffering means God doesn't exist, well, if this were a scale, it's not. If it were a scale, well, good and pleasure means that he does exist. Now we got to compare how much bad is there to how much good is there. And you got to just weigh it out. Now you're weighing out. That would be an accurate way to think about, or to argue the very point that he's trying to make. How much bad is there? How much good is there? Oh, well, kind of evens out. So maybe it's actually a little bit more good than bad, and therefore God does exist.
Yeah, well, remember, he pretty much granted already that you can't suffer unless you're conscious, and that consciousness already means that God exists. So he's not even arguing, in my view, for God. He's pretty much conceded that his argument actually means that God is more likely. He's really arguing that God might be bad, essentially, and that a good God wouldn't allow suffering. So he's pretty much already conceded that there's at least a God already, in my view.
Right.
Just predation is
But there's also cute things about, like, otters holding hands so they don't
true.
swim away.
But could you have that without the suffering?
Pause.
That's the question. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Good fun.
Well, I don't know if anybody's still watching this, Darwin, but if they are, any final thoughts on this first little section of Alex O'Connor debating 25 Christians?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate that whenever an atheist is making an argument, you need to always think about what is being assumed. Anytime anyone makes an argument, you should always think about what is not being said, what must be true in order for that premise to be true. It must be true that there's something actually wrong or bad about suffering in order for God to have to stop the suffering. And so he's got to be saying that there's something wrong with suffering. And then is it true that if there's wrongness in the world or badness in the world, that would make more sense on atheism or theism? So my point is that whenever you're talking to atheists, you need to always really look at their arguments and never just grant them. You have to scrutinize everything and think about what is being implied. And they're almost always going to be borrowing presuppositions or assumptions that only make sense on theism. So Alex here, he's borrowing the idea that objective morality would exist or objective values would exist. That's just kind of a given within his argument. And that doesn't even make sense on atheism, but he's having to borrow and use that in order to make his argument. And you have to say, wait a second, is there actually something wrong with suffering that God would stop? Or is suffering not actually wrong? It's just something that you see and you say, icky, which is totally not an argument, right? Oh, I see stuff that I personally find icky, so therefore it's not likely that God exists. That's a terrible argument. He doesn't want to say that.
And that is his argument. That's exactly what his argument is.
So you just have to really, and if you're talking to an atheist, you really have to focus on your points and not let them move you away from your points. You've got to be able to control the conversation a bit. And Alex was very good at controlling the conversation and talking about what he wanted to talk about. A lot of the Christians that came to the table and they started off with good questions, but then they immediately got distracted by Alex and started to play defense. And they also started to talk about Christianity when they shouldn't have, because the argument that Alex was making was not necessarily about Christianity. So I think that there's a lot of things that we as Christians can learn from this video. And the main takeaway, in my view, though, is to always question those assumptions that are within the argument.
The Bible tells us to be ready always to give an answer, and most Christians aren't. That's why Darwin to Jesus does what he does on Twitter, on X, excuse me. That's why we do what we do over at creationtoday.org. We do a discipleship program every week, having conversations, teaching people how to defend their faith, because it's so critical. Most people are not ready to do it, but God commands us to be. So don't have a very shallow faith. Don't be a lazy Christian. Study to show yourself approved unto God, a workman that needs not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. Let's dig into God's word. Let's dig into God's truth and stand on that as our foundation for everything. I've got a talk, Darwin, that I do called Every Argument Against God Proves God. And it's similar vein, but we go through how there's only 3 types of arguments. It's either a scientific argument or a moral argument or a logical argument. Those are your only arguments against God. And then we show where the foundation of those are. If you don't start with God, you can't get laws of logic, laws of science, and laws of morality. You just can't get them. So it's a fun little way to expose every argument against God assumes that God exists. And I think Alex just showed us that very clearly today. So Alex, as soon as you're willing to bow the knee and admit this, welcome to Christianity, buddy. Jesus loves you, man.
Yeah, I want to say one other thing about Alex, which is that I think that if he gets saved, and I really hope that he does, he'll be a wonderful Christian. I think that will be fantastic to have him on the team. I think that he is really great at arguing. I think he'd be very passionate. He and I are very much alike in some ways. And I really pray that he does get saved. I think that he will. I think that he's searching pretty seriously, and he's going to eventually give up. He's just young, and when you're young, you want to live for yourself, I think. So be in prayer for Alex, guys, and for all of the atheists. And also, Eric, I wanted to remind you that this is only part of the video, and you plan on reviewing the other parts of the video, because this is just one 20-minute section, and there are 3 other sections that you're planning on reviewing with other people, right?
Yeah, I'm excited about that. And hey, for those of you, if you're an atheist or you've seen this, or maybe you're where Darwin was back when he was an atheist, and these kind of thoughts, he kept logically going down, and God kept showing him, wow, God has to exist. And by the way, his testimony, I don't know where all you have it. I know I've got it on our website called Atheist to Evangelist, your whole hour-and-a-half testimony. It's incredible. So I would encourage you to check that out, or on his YouTube or on his X platform. You can see his writings and his videos. Really does a great job of lovingly communicating with the skeptic audience, because that's where he was. So he does a great job of communicating with them. And if you're curious about the truth, man, I got a gift for you. It's completely free. This isn't for me. This is for you. creationtoday.org/gift. creationtoday.org/gift. Would love for you to go there. And it takes about, actually, it's a decent read, about a 7-minute read. But man, if you want to spend 7 minutes truly understanding the gospel, go to creationtoday.org/gift. You'll love it. Love it. Darwin, thanks for hanging out with me tonight, man.
Yeah, this was wonderful. I really appreciate you having me on, and this was great. I really hope that other Christians benefit from this, and maybe even Alex will watch it and we can talk about it sometime.
Let's schedule a conversation with Alex. That sounds great. I'd love it. I'd love it.
Wouldn't that be fun?
All right, Alex, I won't say you're so cool, but I will say I love you. I really do. We wouldn't be spending this time if we didn't love you. And that's to all the skeptics. To all the skeptics out there, we love you. And Darwin loves you. And
Absolutely.
we take this time because we love you. That's the reason. Awesome. God bless, guys. Make sure you're following Darwin over at his channels on YouTube and on X. And we'll look forward to seeing you for the next section of this review of 1 atheist versus 25 Christians.